Thank you and good morning. What I want to do today is give you a perspective on where your particular specialization is going, in my view, which is around the ability to field agile capability and exploit commercially, because a lot is changing and a lot has changed in the way we see from a customer point of view what we loosely term ISR, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. So just a quick thumbnail on Leonardo, so to orientate you. The numbers speak for themselves, but the one I would just highlight is the investment we make in R&D, 1.4 billion euro. That's about 12% of revenue. That is unusual. That's higher than you would find in most European defense primes. And of course, if you're operating in the US and you're used to the warm cloak of DARPA around you, then it's hugely more than the indigenous investment that US companies make. Here in the UK, it's the middle two who represented the helicopter business down at Yeovil and electronics, defense, security systems. Not a stone's throw away from here, you'll find one of the major plants. The reason I'm here, though, is because of my role as the chair of the Defence Solutions Centre, which is part of the Defence Growth Partnership. Andy later will add a lot of granularity on how this works and what it's all about. But essentially, it's a government-industry partnership aimed at sustaining the defence industrial sector in the UK by increasing our export performance. It's all about exports. And in thumbnail, the Defence Growth Partnership itself works in two modes. The first mode, it's a nightclub. So it's a place you go, maybe to meet some like-minded people, understand what's going on in the sector, gather information about what's good, what's bad, etc. If you then want to progress, you'd go into the Defence Solutions Centre, which is a dating agency, because that brings you alongside technologies, funding, and companies with potentially the muscle and market access that you may not have. If that's working for you, then that's all pre-competitive, because it has to be, because it's funded by government. At the point at which you are, or you determine you want to form an alliance, then it becomes competitive, and then you're out into the DGP, the Defence Growth Partnership again, but this time the Defence Growth Partnership acting as a marriage broker, so much firmer than the interaction that takes place in the Defence Solutions Centre. As I say, Andy will add lots of granularity to that later. But why am I really here as well as that? You've heard, I am just entering my 50th year in this sector. That began last Sunday, and a lot of that, 35 years of that at least, was spent on operations. And so I'll give you the view of the operational commander and the view of the customer. Also, I think it's important that we understand that my experience has crossed the Cold War and the post-Cold War period, sort of starting with the Balkans, etc. The nature of military operations, the nature of defense problems has changed profoundly in that time, and the capability you require has to change with it, and that is a significant challenge. Capability is about platforms, weapons, sensors, and systems. And the balance between those four things is interesting to see how it shifted over particularly the last 15, 20 years. Because if you think of a fast jet aeroplane, we're at the limit of physics on the engine-airframe combination. It's going to be a long time before we get HOTL and those sorts of things. Whereas in systems, sensors, and software, there is still plenty of legs in the technology to be exploited, and that's what I want to really concentrate on today. The last reason I'm here is this, not to drink lots of beer, but when I was an undergraduate physicist, second year optics exam, defined the refraction pathways through a dimple beer glass. I remember it well. I had not the first idea, but I bet if I look carefully at the posters outside, I'll get some hints. So I share that background with you. I'm going to look at 4 challenges: the operational challenge, what it is we confront; the science and technology challenge, which is what do we need to pursue; the exploitation challenge, and that's a serious, if you like, a serious aspect that is often missing in government-funded research programs, because the government sees itself as a customer, and this single customer is funding to meet its own needs. More in a minute. And then lastly, the sustainability challenge. That's a bit of a rant, because actually I leave this company on Friday, so I'm in a position where I can rant. So the operational problem to start with. This is essentially all about what the customer is facing. And this is the epitome of the battle space: confused, contested, complex, and connected. Doctrinally, that's what we constantly have to remember. And as we got into the groove, as it were, of counterinsurgency, we recognized that we needed to be able to deal with time-sensitive targets. And the whole focus of our being, immediately after the Cold War, was how do we reduce addressing a time-sensitive target to single-digit minutes. So we wanted to be under 10 minutes. So you get a hit on your intel, whatever it is, and you want to put a weapon on it within 10 minutes. And we are absolutely obsessed by that. And a lot of the development you've seen that goes into UAVs has come out of that era. And that is fine to a certain extent. But when you get into long campaigns, particularly in counterinsurgency, particularly against enemies like Al-Qaeda or indeed Taliban, then you are dealing more with pattern of life. And pattern of life is this. Well, how can I spot the oddball? How can I spot something that doesn't quite fit? And so bridging those two has one common feature: persistence. And that's what we're about in ISR. Until we can get persistence, we are constantly going to be behind the enemy. And we are getting there. And one of those aspects, with asymmetric enemies, the sort of slightly difficult to understand counterinsurgent that you might find in Al-Qaeda, whichever way you look at it, that asymmetric target becomes a conventional target for a fleeting moment in time, because they have to communicate, they have to move like this. And so finding that moment when an unconventional target becomes a conventional target requires persistence, as does pattern of life. And one of the most important things to do with persistence, it sets you on a journey around weight, around power, and around cooling. In other words, you've got to minimize those, the requirements for those things. In the past, we relied heavily on space-based radar for pattern of life. That's an image from a Cosmos SkyMed, that's one of our commercial satellites, which does change detection. So it can do change detection down to 2 millimeters of movement. It's radar, so it works through cloud, works in all weather. It is used in the civil application. For example, we did a presentation recently to the world's greatest tunnelers, because when you're tunneling, it's best you don't move the big skyscrapers that are above you. And we provide a detection capability. We do it for railway embankments and all that sort of thing. It's big. It's expensive, yeah, it works, but is not really optimized for the world that we're facing. On the other hand, Here is a high-altitude pseudo-satellite, that's Zephyr, and that is capable of staying airborne for weeks, if not months. Has a 33-meter wingspan, that's about the size of a Boeing 737. And if you compare that with, say, the leading edge at the moment, which would be Global Hawk, which remains airborne for about 33 hours. Everything's 33 at the moment. So this is the direction of travel. Now, to make that work, then you are very definitely in lower weight, lower power, and lower cooling. So if we start to look at the technology problem here, and what it is we are demanding, or the user is demanding from science. Here is an indication. This is just one indication on airborne electro-optics. On the left is a tiled pod, thermal imaging targeting pod, developed not a million miles away from here, fielded very quickly in 1991 for the first Gulf War. That's the sort of image you saw on your screen, and it would be fine if you were dealing in things like Cold War targets, fixed targets, which you knew a lot about. But in the sort of fast-moving maneuver warfare that you find certainly in the campaign in 91 and subsequent in 2003, it's not as easy as that. So you are dealing with what we term blobology in order to identify a legitimate target. That places a huge burden on a crew, and it might be a single pilot crew, in adhering to the rules of engagement, because there's a huge amount of judgment in that. Heat of the moment, someone's firing stuff at you, you're probably at low level, you're bouncing all over the place, you've got about 9-10 seconds to resolve the target. It is a huge burden to put on aircrew. Here, and we used that in 2003, I might add. Here we have the sniper pod, which is now, which was put on the UK Harrier in about 2006 for use in Afghanistan. But the difference in discrimination speaks for itself. And so, the first thing that customers demand, of course, is higher imagery resolution. And there is a good reason for that, because none of us want to end up in the international court because we haven't adhered to international humanitarian law. And the direction of travel, as I see it, we're into now mastering smaller and smaller pixel sizes, dragging in high-definition technology across the commercial boundary. And again, higher resolution is a trade-off for size, weight, etc. But that's the direction of travel. Someone asked me last night about IR countermeasures, and again, the Leonardo as Celex as was, which was partnered with Northrop Grumman, is a world leader in laser pointer trackers and has produced more than 3,000 of them. And we now have produced a thing called MISIS, which is a DIRCM system with a high-power laser in it, and it weighs less than 50 kilos, and we think that's good. 50 kilos, we think that's good. But boy, have we got to get that down. So these are the sorts of things that are very much in the customer's mind, and that's what they're driving for. But if you're a relatively small but important customer, you won't have the science ecosystem, or indeed the industrial ecosystem, to bring it together to pursue this sort of thing. But the UK has, obviously. Here's how I describe the problem when I'm talking to other governments, for example, and say, look, here are the trends. Stuff is too expensive. Everybody's asking for multi-capable sensors, and you all want commonality, all in open systems architecture and everything else. And then when you look at the technical challenges, then yeah, it's got to be small. The targets we're asked to deal with are obscure. That could be anything from a $200 motorbike in open countryside in Afghanistan through to very complex urban targets. So you've got to be able to deal with this array of targets, and the spectrum itself is very crowded. Interestingly, DARPA have just started a program on using artificial intelligence to control the spectrum. I think that's, in fact, the call is out now. But in my view, the spectrum is one of the big funnels in all of this. And then when it comes to backing your winners, as it were, and this was very much our formative thinking when we put the Defence Growth Partnership together and I was leading technology and enterprise, is, how do we ensure that we make the right choices? And the customer will always go for maturity. Their customers will be generally risk-averse in terms of leading-edge technology. But in order to exploit fully, you need as wide a possible market. And I'll come back to that because exploitation is a key aspect. So, this is what the menu is, if you like, of what we're looking at and what you'll be more than familiar with. High operating temperature detectors, better performance than uncooled, and probably at a lower price than cooled. Photon counting lasers open up the prospect of laser communications, opens up LiDAR, opens up burst illumination lasers, again something that we have plenty of company experience in, but there's a lot more to do. I think quantum science will help us enormously in improving the sensitivity of detectors and dealing with the inevitable signal-to-noise problems. I think the whole business of metamaterials and metasurfaces, where I'm way out of my comfort zone, but the DARPA Extreme program is seeking to work those through. And even things like additive manufacturing. And I'll give you a short cameo on how, as an enabler, additive is quite important. So, that's fine. And the science is great, and there's plenty of expertise. This is the tricky one. Getting the commercial exploitation right and getting the decision right. And here is something I frequently extol, and it's very important in the UK, where traditionally we have exported platforms, be it Typhoon or going back a bit, ships. But the potential, if you look at the UK's defence industrial base, we do about, on average over the last 10 years, £7.5 billion worth of exports a year. And 85% of that is in the air sector. And a whole chunk of that is actually to one customer, which is never a good way to run your sector. Now, if you then say, well, what are we doing in terms of 5th and 6th generation aircraft? The answer is nothing, because 5th is taken care of by JSF, so our indigenous capability in the future of fixed-wing combat airplanes is minimal. 6th, when we're looking at uninhabited combat air vehicles and a mix, then UK is in an alliance with France in producing a European version. But that's a long way off. So as far as exports are concerned, where your customer wants a product that they understand, that has got brand UK on it and preferably battle proven, the locker is getting more and more empty. But it isn't all gloom, because in what we term as intelligent systems, in other words, this is the sensors, software systems that I referred to earlier, then the addressable market is huge. And there are plenty of customers out there who want to upgrade. They'll keep a platform in use sometimes for 50 years. But boy, do they want to do spiral development of its capability. In other words, they'll chase the technology as it matures. And that's the sort of market that we see in that domain. So 7 years, potentially for the Defence Growth Partnership, we can see 94 billion out there. Now, if you only get 10% of that, then you are beating your 7.5 billion a year. So the whole business of the relationship between the science and physics of the engine airframe combination into the sensors, systems, and software is real. There is a real market out there. And so the last part of this conundrum is making the investment decision. And this is where governments are not good, because they, quite rightly, are fixated by their own requirement. They're funding it, why wouldn't they be? And to make that investment decision requires a good understanding of the maturity of the technology, and it may be at TRL3, but it requires a good understanding of the risk inherent in bringing it through the valley of death. In all our work in the UK, we recognize that probably there are three things that are required to drive through the valley of death successfully. The first is finance, and the idea that the customer is going to finance this is something that in the UK stopped a long time ago. The second is the management and protection of intellectual property, which I have to say, given the amount of work that's gone into the whole business of intellectual property protection in the UK over the last 25 years, it surprised me how little that had actually permeated itself out into the sector. And then the third is the effect of a wide appeal from the market. That is the driver, because if you can see, and if you are nurturing conversations with strategic customers saying, yeah, you may be thinking about putting a new radar in your F-16, but just a minute, because in 3 or 4 years, we see this technology maturing and you'll be able to do this, this, and this. If you have that sort of relationship, then you can drive stuff through the valley of death with somewhat less friction than you would normally. And that's what we do in the Defence Growth Partnership. We have those conversations linked up with government in order to ensure that what we pull through has wide market appeal. In other words, we are trying to get technology to the market with competitive advantage ahead of the competitors. And so this business of the investment decision is really quite complex. And the trouble is, in government, it's not in the DNA to think about exploitation in quite the way we do in the private sector. It's not in the DNA, certainly, to think about exportability, because that's not what we use UK taxpayers' money for. So this business of being able to understand the ease with which you can get through the valley of death and the commercial prospects, the exploitability of it, rests in industry. And that's why the Defence Growth Partnership as a marriage between industry and government really works in this sense, because we're hard-nosed about where we spend our shareholders' money, and so are they. So there is significant advantage in taking the approach that we've taken. Some examples here. This is the results of an innovation challenge that we did in the Defence Solutions Centre in partnership with government. And we did 2 themes which are of interest, one on immersive training and the other on, of course, persistent ISR. Here are 2 of the winners of the persistent ISR challenge. We had 10 million of government money, and we picked 4 winners at the end of phase 1 to go into phase 2. One of those winners was Kinetic. One was Birmingham University. And the other 2 I'm showing you now, Glendower Innovations, because this links to what I was saying earlier. The 4 winners shared 1.35 million, and it was pretty much even across them, actually. So, about 3.5 million apiece to be able to develop from phase 1 to phase 2. And in doing that, this is Glendower's very interesting sensor, which has a mass of 936 grams. So here we are now beating the size, weight, power, cooling problem. And they delivered a demonstrator, and as you see, 150 millimeter diameter. So their phase 2 result is they want to find clients for these ultra lightweight optical systems. And what do you know? Here is Zephyr again, the high altitude pseudo satellite. And this is precisely the sort of thing that their sensor is made for. Airbus, who now, this was originally developed by Kinetic. Airbus bought it lock, stock and barrel. And now the Ministry of Defence has bought 3 for delivery, first of all, in 2017. And they'll use it for, particularly for special forces, persistent ISR. And Glendower have now a sensor which is absolutely optimized for this. Airbus, therefore, are spending $2 million on the integration of lightweight sensors into this platform. And I spoke to the managing director of Glendower a couple of weeks ago on the phone, and he said, we would not have been able to get into this sort of relationship, both with government and with big industry, had it not been for the Defence Growth Partnership. So the exposure, the bringing together, that nightclub, dating agency, marriage broker, really works. And these are still in the formative stages, but this is the sort of thing we want to see, because we're dragging through technology, which initially was at low TRL, bringing it through the valley of death, making sure there's the wraparound and the addressable market available. And here's another one. This is Amethyst Research. It's just happened to have been teamed with us at one stage. An imaging system using HOT. And again, about 350,000 bought them through. And they produced a demo camera. And they have a program running up to 2018, and you can see our old brand Selex in there. And what they're looking for now in phase 2 is the ability to find partnerships, and particularly in this case, they need manufacturing capital. It's quite a capital-intensive business. So there's 2 examples where you can spend £350,000 and get good results. Finally, this sustainability problem. My 50th year in this sector. And what is it I mean? This is some work by a colleague of mine, Nick Cook. And you will see on the left there the epitome of what was going on post-war up until the early 80s. I ring in green October the 3rd, 1967, because that was 5 days after I joined the Royal Air Force. And that group of stuff is what stimulated me and my generation in the late 50s and 60s to want to be engineers, to want to be physicists, to want to be in this sector, because it was glamorous. There were 30-odd programs going through Farnborough when I was an undergraduate. There were real things that pushed out the boundary of engineering and science. Everybody of my generation who had a scientific bent just wanted to be part of it. It was the place to be. And without a doubt, this higher, faster, further, and get to the moon stuff really drove people's imagination, and it did a lot for society. All those things that came out of the defence sector in that era. So very much the right stuff. But the wrong stuff is what's happened since, and it is since. And I deliberately put Jim Alber's quote up there of 2005 to explain that this has been going on for a number of years. So we in the UK, and you can probably, you can certainly apply the same to any Western European sector, and you can apply it also to the US sector to a certain extent. But austerity and cutbacks, the way in which acquisition policy changes the motivation for us to invest our shareholders' money in a particular stream of technology or indeed a particular product. Defence as your single customer, domestic customer, is always precarious. And So it goes on. But the bottom line there was if you can't export, then you're dead. And internally then, reducing costs, avoiding risk, and maximizing shareholder value. And, fair enough. When I was in the public sector, I was remembering you're spending taxpayers' money. Well, in the private sector, we're spending our shareholders' hard-earned money. But the result is, first and foremost, the top two, to me, are the real difficult ones. An innovation crisis, and that's why, and Andy will talk about this, that's why in the US and the UK, US with its third offset, UK with its innovation initiative after the Strategic Defence Review, that's what they're trying to address. But boy, the horse has bolted. And it's bolted because of the drought of engineers. So we have a problem. And this is how the problem manifests itself. This is the age demographic in your business. This is the electronics division in our company. And you will see the peak at 50 to 59, and you will see coming up behind, there ain't a lot. And that is a huge worry. That's the same in Thales. It's the same generally in the US. And that is a problem. Also, this is the percentage of female engineers. That's the UK. And then countries like Hungary, Lithuania, up at 30-odd%, UK down at 6%. So we're missing a lot of talent as well. And if that wasn't bad enough, then this is. If I put up the top 20 technology and engineering universities 15 years ago for research and teaching, remember research-led teaching is important, then you would have seen probably 5 in the UK, you would have seen 1 other in Europe, and the rest would have been in the US. If I put up the whole league table today, there'll be 4 in the four in the UK, 7 in the Far East here, and the remainder in the US. This is a significant shift in the way intellectual property and the body of knowledge has shifted eastward. And we need to take note of this. 2 of the leading universities in Singapore, little city-state, not to mention the significance of China and South Korea. So this is a trend. And in our science ecosystem, this is very important because maintaining and sustaining the ecosystem is a lot to do with inward investing. And we have just let our first research contract to a university in Singapore, something to do with rotor heads. We wouldn't have dreamt of that 8-9 years ago. But this is a fact. So we have this sustainability problem to deal with. So I'll leave you with that. But in terms of conclusion, the user is desperate for enhanced performance. The science is there. This is not about making an engineer frame combination do something that the law of physics won't allow it to do. There is potential here. There are improved funding opportunities, certainly in the UK and the US. There is now targeted funding at these small ideas, and there is the capability to bring it through the valley of death whilst preserving the ownership of the intellectual property. There are more opportunities for partnership, and again, this is particularly in the UK, where, frankly, we often didn't know what was going on in the deep ends of the low TRL spectrum of research. There is now a systematic, codified, and evidence-based approach to the export market, rather than just randomly looking at requirements as they come up. There is now a concerted effort in the DGP to shape that market. And finally, I think it is an era of opportunity. So it's not all bad by any means, but boy, we've got to get the young people coming through our education system, wanting to go into engineering and physics, and wanting to be part of that. And that's a challenge. Thank you.